Let the medieval times begin.
Imagine this. A ragtag army of warriors, sweating in armour under the sun, thousands of miles from home, supplies stretched thin, massively outnumbered, and still winning. These Crusaders achieved victories that defy logic. How? Was it divine intervention, dumb luck, or was there something more going on? Hollywood's portrayal of clumsy knights in tin suits bumbling through castle sieges didn't paint the full picture. The real Crusaders, way more strategic, way more intense. In this video, we're peeling back the chainmail to uncover the hidden advantages that made these warriors so formidable. Were they simply braver, or did they possess a secret weapon that no one talks about? Stick around, because you'll see how a bunch of medieval misfits turned into a war machine leave a lasting impact on history. But first, let's rewind a little. When you picture a Crusader, what pops into your head? A clunky tin can on a horse? A guy swinging a sword and screaming religious zeal? Fair enough, but that image barely scratches the surface. These warriors were a lot more complex and a lot more dangerous than you might think. The real story is way more interesting, so let's bust some of those biggest myths about who these guys actually were. The Crusader armies? More than just knights in shining armour. You had feudal levies, skilled mercenaries, and even ordinary pilgrims tagging along. Some armed, some just hoping to survive the trip. This wasn't some one-size-fits-all cavalry charge. We're talking foot soldiers, archers, siege engineers, and entire support teams marching into unfamiliar territory. The Crusades began in the late 11th century when the Byzantine Empire sent envoys to the west for help. Pope Urban II responded to the call, not just to provide support, but to launch a campaign to reclaim the Holy Land. To understand why those calls for help mattered so much, we've got to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. For centuries, the Holy Land, including Jerusalem, had been a crossroads of faith, sacred to Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike. Pilgrims from Europe were able to access these sites, but power in the region was changing hands, and with it came growing uncertainty about who controlled what, and for how long. A new force, the Seljuk Turks, pushed deep into the Byzantine territory. Pilgrims were facing more danger, and access to sacred sites was no longer guaranteed, making the calls for help harder to ignore. Tensions were high, and the call for help from Byzantium lit the fuse. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at the Council of Clermont to take up arms, reclaim Jerusalem, and defend the faith. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was a rallying cry. The message spread like wildfire, and the Crusades erupted. The Crusades weren't ordinary invasions. They were chaotic, unpredictable quests fueled by faith, loyalty, gold, glory, and the promise of something more. And the journey itself, it was an unforgiving filter. Thousands perished from disease, starvation, or infighting before they even reached the Holy Land. The ones who did, they weren't tourists. They were survivors forged by hardship and grit. This wasn't a pilgrimage, it was a trial by fire. Scorching heat, unfamiliar terrain, enemies who knew every inch of the battlefield. The Crusaders were out of their element. So how did they win? Was it luck, brute strength, or something far more strategic? Fighting a war far from home takes more than courage. It takes serious gear. And the Crusaders, especially their knights, came equipped with some of the most advanced military tech the medieval world had ever seen. Let's start with the armour. Knights wore a halberd, a long shirt of thousands of tiny metal rings that covered the body from shoulder to knees. On the head, a coif, a hood of chainmail. Legs protected by chaussets, flexible mail leggings. And underneath it all, thick padding like a gambeson or acketon, designed to absorb impact and prevent the mail from rubbing against the skin. As the Crusades went on, knights began adding individual plate elements over the elbows, knees and shins, inching closer to the full suits of armour we think of today. This wasn't just armour, it was survival. Against many of the slashing and piercing weapons, it held strong, and enemies were often shocked by how much damage a knight could take and then stay in the fight. While a direct, heavy strike could still stun or injure, it often stopped those hits from becoming fatal and kept them alive. Now for the weapons. The Crusader kit was purpose-built for their fighting style. The long sword wasn't just for flashy swings. Its pointed tip was made to thrust, stab, and pierce through gaps in mail or padded armour. It was quick, deadly, and brutally efficient. But when speed and precision weren't enough, Crusaders turned to axes and maces, heavy hitters meant to dent helmets, crack bones, and break armour, even without a clean strike. These weapons were designed to immobilize an enemy, regardless of their armor. One of the Crusaders' greatest advantages was their heavy cavalry. These weren't just people on horses, they were mobile battering rams. Their signature move? The couched lance charge. Riders held it firmly under their arm to deliver the full momentum of horse and rider in one devastating hit. Add in stirrups, which let the rider brace for impact, and the result was devastating. One well-timed charge could break an enemy line. It was a force multiplier. Behind it all were powerful war horses, destriers, bred for size, stamina, and strength. But gear alone didn't win battles. Crusader warriors were shaped early, raised in a world where they learned to ride before they could walk, and wield a sword before they could read. These were survival skills. Training wasn't a phase, it was a way of life, forging warriors whose instincts were honed for battle. This lifelong training in riding, weapons, and battlefield discipline became the backbone of their effectiveness. Was this intense, lifelong dedication the secret weapon we mentioned earlier? It certainly feels like a strong contender. Picture this: lords and knights bound by oath, loyalty forged not just by politics but by land, legacy, and belief. This was the feudal system, messy, flawed, but effective. At home, it could spark rivalries and rebellion, but on Crusade, loyalty ran deep because it was tied to land, honour, and duty. A knight didn't just fight for a king. They fought for their lord, their lineage, and the case they had sworn to uphold. In a world without standing armies, this web of loyalty wasn't just structure, it built bonds. Those ties became the glue that held the Crusaders together. They weren't mercenaries. Crusaders were bound by duty, oath, and legacy. Their loyalty wasn't rented, it was sworn. On the battlefield, that mattered. When survival depends on the person next to you and backing down means disgrace, you don't run, you hold the line. Even in chaos, the hierarchy held. From the top commanders to each knight and their household, everyone had a place and a reason to stand their ground. And then there was religious zeal. The Crusades weren't just military campaigns. For many, they were acts of faith, a holy war, a path to salvation. That shared purpose had power. It brought thousands under one banner. When you think you're fighting for something bigger than yourself, fear hits different. It gave them grit, unity, and the will to push through hardship. However complex that motivation was, it gave them an edge that's hard to measure, but impossible to ignore. Strong leadership turned belief into action. Many of the Crusader commanders weren't new to war. They were seasoned nobles and princes with experience from battles back home. Figures like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of St. Gilles, and later Richard the Lionheart had already earned their reputations long before the Crusades. They knew how to lead men, manage supplies, and plan sieges that could last for weeks. Sure, there were power struggles and bruised egos, but when the pressure hit, these guys could pull it together. What made them dangerous wasn't just bold moves, it was knowing when to adapt and when to strike. The Crusaders had a secret weapon in the form of military orders, warrior monks, the Knights Templars, and the Knights Hospitallers. Bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but trained like elite troops. In a world of loose alliances, they were the closest thing to a standing army, and that's what made them unstoppable. The Templars and Hospitallers didn't just fight, they held the line, trained relentlessly, forged by discipline, driven by faith. They didn't waver, they didn't run. When chaos hit, they stood firm. They never broke formation, never retreated without orders, and fought to the end. Small in number, but high in impact. Their presence could steady a crumbling line or deliver a crushing blow. Could this spiritual and social binding, displayed by these warrior monks, be the strategic advantage that we talked about earlier? It certainly seems like a vital piece of the puzzle. Superior gear, relentless training, and tight-knit loyalty made the Crusaders a force to be reckoned with. But brute strength isn't enough to win battles. Strategy is also needed. And despite the useful image of them as brute force warriors, the Crusaders showed surprising tactical skill. On the battlefield, they didn't just fight hard, they fought sharp. One of their most significant strengths was their mastery of combined arms tactics. They didn't just charge in as a wall of knights, they fought as a unit. Can you imagine a disciplined infantry line, bristling with spikes and spears holding firm? These foot soldiers weren't merely fodder, they were the shield, the anchor, the base. They kept the chaos at bay. It was a layered approach that kept the army balanced and impenetrable. While infantry held the line, archers and crossbowmen unleashed volleys to break formations and soften the enemy. Then came the heavy cavalry, thundering forward to strike at just the right moment, when the pressure was highest. This wasn't chaos, it was a calculated move, a deadly ballet of steel, discipline and coordinated charge. The infantry would absorb the initial shock, the archers would thin the enemy, and the cavalry would deliver the decisive, crushing blow. This wasn't a free-for-all, it was a machine, brutal, precise, and built to break armies. When every part moved together, the result was unstoppable. Marching through enemy land, the Crusaders became a fortress on the move. They also excelled at defensive formations, crucial when facing mobile, harassing forces. The famous hedgehog formation was a tightly packed marching column. Infantry locked shields and angled spears outward, guarding the cavalry and supply lines within. It was discipline in motion. This formation helped them absorb constant pressure and repel fast-moving attacks. They adapted their formations to resist the hit-and-run tactics of their enemies, avoiding ambushes and staying one step ahead. Beyond open-field battles, the Crusaders broke cities open. They were skilled in siege warfare too. They became the masters of engineering, deploying formidable siege engines like trebuchets, giant catapults capable of hurling massive stones over enemy walls. They built siege towers, rolled them right up to enemy battlements, and below it all, skilled sappers chipped away at the foundations, collapsing walls from underneath. The sieges of Jerusalem, Antioch and Acre weren't flukes, they were brutal, calculated takedowns. This wasn't about smashing gates, it was about breaking defences brick by brick until nothing stood in their way. Holding ground meant more than winning battles, it meant building fortresses. They built supply lines and fortified their hold on the land with massive castles like Crac de Chevalier and Belvoir. These weren't just stone walls, they were feats of military engineering. With layered defences, reinforced gates and watchtowers placed with precision, these fortresses could hold out for months, sometimes years, against sieges. Small garrisons inside could control vast areas, securing trade, movement and territory deep in enemy lands. Out here, a castle wasn't shelter, it was dominance. It's also important to acknowledge that the Crusaders weren't stagnant. They adapted, learning from their enemies, adjusting to the heat and mastering the terrain. They incorporated tactics, refined techniques and kept evolving. That willingness to learn and adapt shows that tactical flexibility was indeed what set them apart. Apart from the physical and tactical advantages, a powerful intangible weapon was at play: psychological warfare and reputation. Can you imagine being on the receiving end of a couched lance charge? It wasn't just about the physical damage, it was the sheer terror, the thunder of hooves, the glint of steel, the wall of armoured men and horses bearing down on you. This spectacle alone was often enough to break even the most hardened lines. The power of a Crusader charge didn't just injure, it instilled fear. Crusader victories echoed like thunder, and sometimes the echo hit harder than the sword. Tales spread fast, relentless knights, divine favour, unstoppable charges. Enemies feared them before the first clash, but it wasn't just strength that gave them an edge, it was belief. Their crosses, banners and hymns became more than religious symbols, they projected power. To some, they were holy warriors, to others a terrifying force. Their power wasn't just in the fight, it was in the fear. Could that presence, physical and psychological, be the key to their strength? We'll find out soon. Was this overwhelming presence, this combination of physical might and psychological terror, the definitive factor in their dominance? We'll find out soon. Crusader strength was real, but it wasn't absolute. Their dominance faltered at times, and the Battle of Hattin in 1187 proved just how vulnerable they could be. There, poor decisions and a desperate lack of water led to a crushing defeat. Like any army, they faced setbacks. Disease, supply issues, and internal rivalries could turn even the strongest campaign into disaster. The Crusaders weren't the only ones evolving. Leaders like Saladin adapted quickly, using strategy and speed to turn the tide. Saladin and his forces mastered hit-and-run tactics, cut off supplies, and exploited weaknesses, like the Crusaders' dependence on water and slower movements. So while the Crusaders were often effective, better is never a constant. Their success wasn't guaranteed, it had to be earned, and sometimes they lost, decisively. So why were the Crusaders so effective, especially in those early centuries? It wasn't one secret weapon, it was a fierce combination. Advanced gear, relentless training, unshakable loyalty forged by feudal bonds, and faith, sharp leadership from battle-tested commanders, and tactical flexibility that let them adapt and strike with precision. Their true advantage? They didn't just fight hard, they fought smart. And they fought with a presence that instilled fear long before swords ever clashed. That psychological edge, born from discipline, belief, and brutal reputation, was as real as any blade. From the thunder of a cavalry charge to the unbreakable lines of the military orders, the Crusaders weren't just waging war, they were reshaping how it was fought. So what do you think was their greatest strength? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.